Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I've been camping all my life. There's nothing like the peace of the deep woods, the stillness that settles over the trees when the sun dips below the horizon, and the crackle of the fire cutting through the cold night air. But this last trip, this one changed everything. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. My best friend Matt and I had been planning it for weeks. We both needed a break from our jobs, our lives, and the constant buzz of the city. We picked a secluded spot deep in the Appalachian woods, miles from the nearest town. A place where we could just disconnect. The first day was perfect. We hiked for hours, set up our tent near a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, and cracked open a couple of beers as the fire crackled beneath a brilliant sky. It was peaceful, serene even. But as the night crept in, that stillness I loved so much began to feel heavy. Like the woods were holding their breath. It started with the sounds. At first, I brushed it off as the usual forest noises, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. You hear that kind of stuff all the time out there. But this was different. The sounds weren't random, like animals scurrying in the underbrush. They were rhythmic, almost deliberate. Matt noticed it too. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice low. "Probably just deer or something," I replied, trying to convince myself more than him. But deep down, I knew something was off. The sounds continued, getting closer. There was a weird cadence to it, like footsteps, slow, purposeful steps that stopped the moment we stopped talking. Every time we shined our flashlights into the woods, we saw nothing but trees, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. By midnight, the noises had stopped, leaving the woods in an unnatural silence. No crickets, no wind, just the crackling of the fire. Matt, trying to lighten the mood, joked about Bigfoot, but neither of us laughed. We turned in for the night, but sleep didn't come easy. The air inside the tent felt suffocating, and every time I closed my eyes, I felt that same sensation, that we were being watched. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of Matt unzipping the tent. "What are you doing?" I mumbled, still half asleep. "Just gotta take a leak," he whispered back, his silhouette outlined by the faint glow of the moon. I heard him step outside and figured I'd try to go back to sleep. But minutes passed, and he didn't return. I sat up, listening. The forest was still eerily quiet, but I could hear faint noises, twigs snapping, the same deliberate footsteps from before. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cold night air. "Matt?" I called, shining the beam around the clearing. Nothing. My heart started pounding in my chest. The fire had died down to embers, casting long, eerie shadows around the camp. That's when I saw him. Matt stood at the edge of the clearing just beyond the reach of the dying firelight. His back was to me, shoulders stiff and hunched, staring into the woods. "Hey man, you good?" I asked, stepping closer. He didn't move. Something about the way he was standing sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't right. His posture was wrong. Like he was too rigid, too stiff. I stopped a few feet away, my breath clouding in the cold air. "Matt," I whispered. Slowly, he turned around. But it wasn't Matt. Not really. His face, it looked like him, sure, but the eyes were wrong. They were too wide, too dark. His mouth twitched like he was trying to smile but didn't quite know how. It was like someone was wearing his skin, pretending to be him, but didn't know how to act human. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then, without a word, he, or it, turned and walked back into the woods. Not hurriedly, just slow, deliberate steps, like it knew I was too terrified to follow. I didn't. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the spot where it disappeared. My body felt like it had been drained of all warmth, all strength. Finally, I forced myself to move, stumbling back to the tent. I didn't sleep. I just sat there clutching the flashlight, waiting for morning. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I ventured out, calling Matt's name over and over. There was no answer, no sign of him. It was like he had vanished. I spent hours searching the woods, but it was useless. The strange thing was, the deeper I went into the forest, the more I found signs of movement. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, but no Matt. Just tracks, and not just his. The footprints were wrong, too large, too misshapen. They were human-like, but distorted, as if whoever, or whatever, had made them didn't quite know how feet were supposed to work. I was ready to head back to camp, to pack up and hike out when I heard it. Matt's voice. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but it was him, calling my name. Relief washed over me and I ran toward the sound. But as I got closer, that feeling of wrongness returned, stronger than ever. His voice was coming from deeper in the woods, much deeper than he could have gone in the time he'd been missing, and there was something off about the tone. It was too calm, too steady. I stopped in my tracks. That's when I noticed something else. The forest was completely silent again. No birds, no insects, nothing. "Come on, man," the voice called again. "I'm over here." I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the car, legs burning, chest heaving. I didn't look back. I just drove. Fast. It's been weeks since that night, and Matt still hasn't been found. Search parties turned up, nothing. No trace of him. It's like he vanished into thin air. But sometimes late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I hear it. His voice, calling my name from just outside my window, but it's not him, and I know better than to answer. I've always been drawn to the woods. Something about the isolation, the serenity, the quiet calls to me like nothing else. So, when I heard about a camping spot deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far off the beaten path and rarely visited, I couldn't resist. It was the kind of trip I craved, remote, untouched, and full of mystery. I planned everything carefully, packing for a 3-day solo excursion. The trek itself took the better part of a day, and by the time I reached the campsite, the sun was already beginning to sink behind the trees. The forest was dense here, the kind where the canopy is so thick it swallows the sky. It was dark, but I welcomed it. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and settled in for what I thought would be a peaceful night. It wasn't long before I realized something was off. As dusk turned to night, I noticed how deathly quiet the forest had become. No crickets chirping, no distant hoot of an owl. Just silence. It was unnerving, but I chalked it up to the thickness of the forest, muting the sounds of wildlife. I had just convinced myself it was nothing when I heard something faint in the distance. A low, guttural growl. I froze. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. Too deep. Too unnatural. The fire crackled beside me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the tree line. The growl came again, closer this time, vibrating through the ground beneath me. My skin prickled, a cold wave of fear washing over me. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark, but there was nothing. Only trees. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just a bear. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But even then, something felt wrong, like the woods themselves were watching. I didn't sleep much that night, every creak and snap from the forest sending my heart racing. But nothing happened. Not until the second night. I'd spent most of the day hiking, trying to clear my head and shake the paranoia that had settled in my bones. But as the day stretched on, I couldn't help but feel like I was being followed. Every now and then I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow flitting between the trees, gone the moment I turned my head. It was subtle, like whatever it was didn't want to be seen. But it was there. I knew it was there. By the time I returned to my campsite, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the ground. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, almost suffocating. I tried to ignore it, to focus on starting the fire and calming my nerves. But then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods just beyond the reach of my firelight. At first I thought it was a person, a hiker maybe, or a ranger, but something about the way it stood, motionless and hunched, set off alarms in my head. I shone my flashlight toward it, and that's when I saw the eyes, yellow, glowing, and far too large for any human. My breath caught in my throat as the figure stepped closer, revealing more of itself. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its body twisted and elongated, like a man stretched beyond human limits. Its skin was a mottled, sickly gray, and its face was all wrong. It was as if someone had tried to sculpt a human face but got everything just slightly off. Too wide, too sharp. The mouth too wide and filled with rows of jagged teeth. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The thing didn't move. It just stood there staring at me with those horrible yellow eyes. Its mouth curled into a grin that looked more like a snarl. I don't know how long I stood frozen in fear, but eventually the thing turned and slunk back into the trees, its movements disturbingly smooth and silent, like it was gliding. I wanted to run, to pack up and leave right then and there, but the forest was pitch black, and the thought of running blind through the woods while that thing was out there made my stomach churn. So I stayed by the fire, clutching my flashlight, barely breathing. I didn't sleep at all that night, and that's when I heard them. Voices, faint at first, like a distant conversation carried on the wind. They were coming from deeper in the woods, too far for me to make out the words. But as they grew louder, I realized something horrifying. They were mimicking my voice, my own voice, repeating phrases I had said earlier that day. "This is going to be a great trip," it said, followed by a garbled, distorted laugh. Then another voice joined in, this one raspier, more guttural, repeating another phrase I had spoken. "The view from here is unreal." I felt sick. Whatever was out there, it had been watching me, listening to me, and now it was mocking me. The voices circled my camp, growing louder, more frantic. It sounded like there were dozens of them, all talking at once, all using my voice, overlapping and twisting until it was a cacophony of distorted sound. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside my head, reverberating through my skull. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag and bolted, abandoning my tent and gear, running blindly through the woods, the voices following me, laughing, repeating my words over and over. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I saw the faint glow of a lantern through the trees. A ranger's station. Relief flooded through me, and I sprinted toward it, pounding on the door until a man opened it, a park ranger, older, with a weathered face and tired eyes. I stumbled inside, gasping out what had happened. The ranger listened, his expression grim, but he didn't seem surprised. When I finished, he nodded slowly and said, "You're lucky you made it out." "Made it out of what?" I asked, my voice trembling. He sighed and glanced out the window, his eyes scanning the dark tree line. "There are things in these woods, things that aren't natural. They mimic what they hear, take shapes you might recognize. But they're not human and they're not friendly." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. What do they want?" The ranger didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the door and locked it, his face pale as he whispered, "We're not alone." And then from just outside the cabin I heard it again. My voice, "Let me in." I've always loved camping, the peace, the quiet, the crackling of a campfire under a blanket of stars. It's like stepping out of time. I've been doing it since I was a kid, and I thought I'd seen everything the wilderness had to offer. But I was wrong. Last summer I decided to do something different, something off the beaten path. No campgrounds, no marked trails, just pure wilderness. There's this spot about 50 miles deep into a national forest that I'd heard about from a fellow outdoorsman. He warned me it was remote and not often traveled. But that's exactly what I wanted. No people, no noise, just me in the wild. The first day was uneventful. I hiked through some thick forest, the air rich with the smell of pine and earth. I set up camp by a small stream, fished a little, cooked some trout over the fire, and watched the stars blink into view. It was perfect. But that night something felt off. It started with the sounds. When you're deep in the woods, you get used to certain noises: wind in the trees, nocturnal animals rustling through the underbrush, the distant calls of owls. But this was different. It was subtle at first, almost like a faint hum, but as the night went on, it grew louder. I couldn't place it, just this low, droning sound like something big was moving through the forest, but too far away for me to make out clearly. I tried to brush it off, told myself it was just the wind or my mind playing tricks on me. But the longer I listened, the more it sounded unnatural. It wasn't rhythmic like the wind. It was random, stuttering almost, like something struggling to breathe. I should have packed up right then and there, but I didn't. I just stoked the fire a little higher and forced myself to go to sleep. The next day I woke up feeling groggy, like I hadn't slept at all. The air felt heavier somehow, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. I packed up and moved deeper into the forest, pushing toward the area I'd heard about, the untouched part where no one ever goes. The farther I hiked, the more isolated I felt. By midday, even the birds had stopped chirping. The forest around me seemed dead. No wind, no movement, just trees standing still like towering sentinels. That strange hum from the night before had returned, faint but ever present, like it was following me. By late afternoon, I found a clearing, a perfect spot to set up camp again. As I unpacked, I noticed something strange. There were markings on some of the trees, deep gouges that didn't look like anything made by an animal. Long, jagged scratches, almost like symbols carved high up into the bark, too high for any normal creature to reach. I ran my hand over one of the marks, and it was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been in the middle of summer. I tried to shake off the unease and focused on building my fire. As night fell, the hum grew louder again. This time, it wasn't just a background noise. It felt like it was closing in on me. And then the whispers started. At first I thought it was the wind slipping through the trees, but there was no wind. The air was dead still. The whispers were faint, just beyond my hearing, like voices carried from a distance, too far to understand but close enough to send a chill down my spine. I'm not someone who scares easily. I've camped in some pretty remote places, and I know the tricks the wilderness can play on your mind. But this was different. This wasn't my mind playing tricks. Something was out there. I sat by the fire, staring into the dark, flashlight in hand, listening. The whispers grew louder, and now I could pick out words. My name. I swear to God it was my name. Jacob. It came from the tree line, from deep within the woods. My heart started racing. No one knew I was out here. There wasn't another soul for miles. I stood up, scanning the trees with my light, but the beam only pierced the first few feet of the dense woods. Jacob, the voice came again, closer this time. I could feel something watching me from the shadows. Every instinct in my body screamed to get the hell out of there, but I was frozen in place, gripping the flashlight like it could somehow protect me. Then I saw it, just a glimpse at first, something tall, too tall to be human, moving between the trees. Its shape was wrong, elongated and twisted, like its limbs were stretched too far. It moved with a jerking, unnatural gait, almost like it didn't know how to walk properly. Jacob! The voice was right behind me now, and I whipped around, expecting to see someone or something, but there was nothing. Just the fire, crackling softly, the only normal sound in an otherwise dead forest. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up what I could, leaving half my gear behind, and started hiking back the way I came. The whispers followed me, circling around, taunting me with my own name. And that hum. It was all around me now, vibrating in my bones, getting louder, closer. As I pushed through the trees, the whispers changed. They stopped saying my name and started imitating me. I heard my own voice echoing back at me from the darkness. It was warped, distorted, but it was me, calling out, begging for help. "Help me, Jacob." I broke into a run, adrenaline flooding my veins. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just needed to get out. But no matter how far I went, how fast I moved, the whisper stayed with me. And worse, that thing, whatever it was, it followed. At one point I glanced back, and there it was, just at the edge of my vision, tall and gaunt, limbs too long for its body, pale skin stretched tight over bone, its head twisted unnaturally, following me as I ran. And its face, God, its face was a blank, empty slate. No features, just smooth, pale flesh. I don't remember much after that. I must have run all night, because the next thing I knew, I was stumbling out of the woods, back onto the main road, drenched in sweat and covered in scratches from the branches I'd pushed through. A search team found me the next day, wandering in a daze miles from where I should have been. I never went back to get the gear I left behind. I never camped again after that. And the worst part? Sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear it. That hum, faint and distant, but growing closer. And I know deep down, it's still out there. It's still waiting. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from the city. 2 nights in a secluded part of the forest where I could reset and leave behind the stresses of work and everything else. I'd camped a lot as a kid, but it had been years since I'd been this deep into the woods, far from any signs of civilization. No signal, no crowds, just me, my tent, and the endless trees. The drive-in was rough, and the ranger I passed at the entrance seemed surprised when I told him I'd be camping alone. He gave me an odd look before saying, "Just make sure you stay on the main trails, and don't be out after dark. Things look different at night." His warning sounded like the usual advice for city folk who think they can rough it in the wild. I just smiled and thanked him, but something in his expression lingered. I hiked out to a spot recommended in a forum just off the main trail, and it seemed perfect. By the time I set up my tent, the sun was dipping low, casting the trees in eerie shades of orange and purple. I gathered wood for a fire, and as I sat there watching the flames, the forest around me grew unnaturally quiet. No wind, no crickets, not even a distant bird call. It felt like I was being watched. That first night I was just starting to fall asleep when I heard something moving outside my tent. It was heavy, each step sending small vibrations through the ground. I reached for my flashlight, clutching it like a weapon, heart racing as I strained to listen. Whatever it was right outside, breathing in slow, ragged huffs that sounded too large, too deep. I held my breath frozen, hoping it would pass. And after what felt like hours, the steps grew fainter and then stopped altogether. I told myself it was just a bear, or maybe an elk. But somehow I knew it was something else. The next morning I went looking for tracks around my tent but found nothing. No disturbed soil, no broken branches, nothing to suggest anything had been there. But as I walked back to camp, I saw something strange in the distance. A large structure like an old hunting tower loomed between the trees, partially hidden by the underbrush. I hadn't noticed it when I set up camp, and it hadn't been on the map. I decided to check it out. The tower was old, almost ancient, with beams rotting and sagging as if it would collapse at any moment. But what unnerved me the most were the symbols carved into the wood. Strange markings that seemed almost familiar yet foreign. Circles, crosses, and shapes that resembled animals but were twisted, misshapen. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were staring back at me, watching. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something moving out of the corner of my eye. A dark shape slipping through the trees, too fast for me to make out any details. I shook it off as my mind playing tricks on me and hurried back to camp. The second night was worse. I'd barely fallen asleep when I was startled awake by voices. They were faint at first, but gradually grew louder, surrounding me, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I tried to ignore it, huddling deeper into my sleeping bag, but the voices grew more insistent, closer, almost frantic. They were right outside my tent, dozens of them, speaking in a low, guttural tone that seemed to pierce through my mind. I fumbled for my flashlight, hands trembling as I switched it on and shone it around the tent. Nothing. The voices stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that weighed down on me. Then, I heard it, the sound of something scratching against the fabric of my tent. Slow, deliberate, like claws dragging across canvas. I was paralyzed, unable to move, too terrified to even breathe. The scratching continued, moving around the tent, circling, taunting. And then, I heard it, a low growl, deep and rumbling, something that shouldn't have been possible for any animal I knew of. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would leave, praying I would wake up. Eventually, the scratching stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, flashlight clutched in my hands, every sound sending a jolt of fear through me. The next morning, I knew I had to get out of there. I packed up as quickly as I could, practically running back to the trail, every nerve on edge. But as I made my way through the forest, something caught my attention. There, just off the trail, was a figure standing between the trees, watching me. At first, I thought it was a person, but as I drew closer, I saw that it was wrong. It looked like a man, but its limbs were too long, its posture too hunched, and its skin was stretched tight, almost translucent. And its face was a twisted, grotesque parody of a human, with empty sockets where eyes should be, and a mouth that hung open, too wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I stumbled back, nearly falling, and as I turned to run, I heard something behind me. Another figure, and another. They were everywhere, moving through the trees, watching me with those hollow eyes, mouths stretching into grotesque smiles. I ran faster than I ever had, not daring to look back until I burst out onto the main trail. I didn't stop until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. I looked back toward the trees, but they were gone. The forest was silent, as if it had swallowed them whole. I drove back to the ranger station, desperate to tell someone, anyone. But when I got there, the ranger wasn't the same man who had been there before. This one was older, with a grizzled beard and tired eyes. I told him everything, the creatures, the tower, the symbols, but he just looked at me, expressionless. "There's no tower out there," he said, shaking his head slowly, "and no one else has been up that way in years. Folks say the woods can play tricks on you, especially when you're alone. Sometimes it's better not to go looking for things." I left, feeling like I was losing my mind, but as I drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror, and there, standing on the side of the road, was the first ranger, the one who'd given me the map, only now his face was stretched, hollow, his mouth hanging open in that same too wide grin. I didn't stop, I didn't look back, but I know I'll never go into those woods again. Whatever I saw, whatever followed me, it's still out there, waiting. And I don't know if it was the forest playing tricks on me, or if I had stumbled into something far more ancient and evil. But I do know one thing, they were watching, and now I feel like they always will be. I hadn't wanted to go camping. The others thought it'd be fun, one last adventure before we all went our separate ways. I had reluctantly agreed, lured by the promise of fresh air and the chance to unplug from everything for a while. That, and the fact that Tom, my best friend since childhood, had practically dragged me along, saying it'd be just like old times. We drove out early, deeper and deeper into the heart of the forest, where the trees grew thicker and the sun struggled to pierce through the canopy. By the time we set up camp, I realized I had no idea where we were. Just an endless sea of green surrounding us, suffocating and vast. It was only after we settled in that Tom mentioned the ranger. "He came by when I scouted this spot last weekend," he said nonchalantly. "Told me some creepy stuff about the area." "Like what?" I asked, mostly to humor him. "Oh, you know, the usual. Legends, creatures, skinwalkers. Thought he was messing with me, honestly. Said he'd been working here for over 20 years and he'd seen things in these woods. But then he just walked away. Gave me the chills. Tom chuckled, but there was something forced about it. Skinwalkers. I'd heard about them in ghost stories, tales shared around campfires to spook kids. But hearing it here, in the depths of the forest, made it feel different. I shrugged it off, though. Legends are just that. Legends. We sat around the fire that night, listening to the sounds of the forest. The night was eerily still, as though even the nocturnal creatures were holding their breath. I felt an inexplicable sense of dread creeping in, but I didn't say anything. Tom and the others would just laugh. It must have been around midnight when the ranger appeared. He was tall, with a broad-brimmed hat casting his face into shadow. His uniform was outdated, like something from decades ago, and he didn't seem to carry any of the usual equipment. No flashlight, no radio. Just him, standing at the edge of our camp, as if he'd materialized out of thin air. "Evening," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "Y'all doing all right out here?" There was something in his eyes that unsettled me, a sharpness, a predatory glint. Tom, oblivious as always, waved him over. I tried to ignore the prickling feeling crawling up my spine as the ranger approached and squatted beside our fire, his face half lit by the flickering flames. "You folks picked a bad spot," he murmured, glancing around at the shadows stretching into the trees. "Strange things happen here." "What kind of strange things?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The ranger's gaze flicked to me. "Things you wouldn't believe. People disappearing. Some found later, wandering, confused, not quite themselves. Others, never found at all." I forced a laugh. "You trying to scare us?" He didn't answer. He just stared at me, a slow, unsettling smile stretching across his face. Then he stood up and melted back into the shadows, disappearing as suddenly as he'd appeared. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, felt amplified, as though the forest itself were alive, watching, waiting. I kept seeing the ranger's face in my mind, that eerie smile, the cold glint in his eyes. I tried to tell myself it was just nerves, that we were safe. But the feeling lingered, a heavy weight pressing down on me. The next morning I woke to find Tom gone. His sleeping bag lay empty beside the fire and his boots were still there. My heart pounded as I scanned the area, but there was no sign of him. The others thought he'd just wandered off, maybe gone to relieve himself. But I knew something was wrong. We spent the day searching, calling his name until our voices grew hoarse, but the forest swallowed every sound. It was as if he'd been erased. By nightfall, I was desperate. I thought about the ranger, about his strange warning, and a horrible suspicion began to take root. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom returned. Or rather, something that looked like Tom. He stumbled into camp, his movements stiff, unnatural, like he was being controlled by some invisible puppet strings. His face was slack, and his eyes, they weren't his eyes. They were empty, devoid of that familiar spark. "What happened to you?" I whispered, taking a step back. He just stared at me, unblinking. When he spoke, his voice was wrong, too, flat, hollow, as though he were repeating words he'd heard 100 times before. "You shouldn't have come here. It's too late now." I felt a cold hand grip my heart as I realized he was mimicking the ranger's words, almost verbatim. I took another step back, and his gaze followed, a slow, deliberate movement that made my skin crawl. The others tried to talk to him, but he just kept repeating those words over and over, his voice growing more distorted, more inhuman with each repetition. Finally, one of the others touched him, and he snapped, lunging forward with a feral snarl. We scrambled away, terrified, as he thrashed and convulsed on the ground. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. He lay still, his chest rising and falling shallowly, his face blank, expressionless. I wanted to run, to get away from him, from this cursed forest, but something held me back. I had to know what had happened to my friend. As I watched him lying there, the truth finally clicked. He wasn't Tom, not anymore. Something had taken him, twisted him, hollowed him out. The ranger's warning echoed in my mind, and I knew with a chilling certainty that the legend was true. A skinwalker had found us. When he opened his eyes again, they weren't empty anymore. They were watching me, knowing, almost mocking. I realized then that it hadn't been a chance encounter with the ranger. It had been a trap. He'd led us here, lured us to this place, and now he was claiming his prize. I don't know what happened to the others. I ran, stumbling through the dark, hearing footsteps echoing behind me, always just a little too close. I've been running ever since, but I know I'll never escape, because the ranger is out there watching, waiting, and he'll never let me go. It was never about the skinwalker. The ranger had been one all along, and I walked right into his trap. I always loved camping alone, the solitude, the quiet. It gave me time to think, to breathe. No distractions, just me, the trees, and the sky. This time I decided to go deeper into the woods than ever before. I found an old trail, overgrown and unused, and followed it for miles until it disappeared entirely. The place I found was perfect, untouched by anyone for what looked like years. The sun was setting when I set up camp. It draped everything in gold and shadow, the trees casting long fingers across the ground. The air was still, but the kind of stillness that felt aware, like the woods were holding their breath. I shrugged off the feeling and got my fire going, trying to shake off the gnawing tension creeping up my spine. As the night settled in, the usual forest noises started up, the rustling of leaves, the chirp of crickets. But it was quieter than I expected. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world around you is listening. My fire was small, just enough to cook some food and keep the night at bay, but it seemed to flicker weaker than it should have. Then I heard it, a distant sound, faint but distinct, like a branch snapping underfoot. I froze, listening hard, but there was nothing more. I glanced toward the trees, my eyes scanning the dark gaps between them. Probably just a deer. That's what I told myself. But it didn't feel like that. I sat back down, forcing myself to focus on the fire, on the crackling logs, and the warmth against the chill of the evening air. The wind had picked up slightly, whispering through the branches above, making them creak like old bones. An hour passed, maybe more. The unease still gnawed at me, but I wasn't about to let my imagination get the best of me. I leaned back against a log and looked up at the stars, trying to let the vastness of the sky swallow my anxiety. That's when I heard it again, a sound closer this time. It wasn't the snap of a branch, it was a voice, faint, carried on the wind. I straightened up, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained to listen, but the voice had stopped. Maybe I imagined it. Out here, in the dark, it's easy for your mind to play tricks on you. And then it came again, louder, clearer. Someone was calling my name, and I felt ice crawl up my spine. My name, out here, deep in the woods, miles away from anyone. It was impossible, but I knew what I'd heard. The voice was soft, pleading, like someone was lost. Someone who knew me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it over the trees. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, illuminating only trunks and shadows. My fire cast a flickering glow, but beyond that the woods were impenetrable. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. "Who's out there?" For a moment the only sound was the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and then the voice came again, closer, much closer. "Please help me." The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was my voice, and I felt my stomach twist into knots, my blood turning cold. It wasn't just similar. It was exactly my voice, calling out from somewhere deep in the trees. And worse, it sounded off, like a recording played back just a little too slow, a little too distorted. Panic surged through me. I stood up, the flashlight trembling in my hand, shining it into the woods, my heart racing. "Who's out there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Nothing." I should have left. I should have packed up my gear right then and there and bolted down the path. But something held me. Some stupid curiosity. Or maybe I was too frozen by fear to move. A branch snapped directly behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam catching something between the trees. It was a figure, standing just at the edge of the light, tall and unmoving. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make out the shape. It was wrong. The figure, it was too tall. Its limbs were long, unnaturally long, hanging limply at its sides. And its face, if you could call it that, was just empty, smooth, like someone had erased its features. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, but the thing didn't move. It just stood there, its head slightly tilted, as if studying me. Then it spoke. "Please, help me." My voice, again. I blinked, shaking my head. This couldn't be real. I pointed the flashlight directly at it, but the light seemed to waver around the figure, as if it were slipping between the gaps of the trees, never fully illuminated. I took another step back, my breath quick and shallow, my mind racing for an explanation. Maybe it was a trick, some kind of prank, but deep down, I knew better. The thing standing in front of me wasn't human, and whatever it wasn't friendly. The thing moved, not walked, moved. Its body seemed to twitch, jerking forward in an unnatural, almost insect-like way. The smooth face twisted as it leaned closer to the edge of the light, and I swear it began to smile, not with a mouth but with the shifting of skin pulling taut as if it were about to burst. "Help me," it said again, my voice dripping with mockery now, low and slow, like it was savoring the sound. I bolted. I don't remember making the decision to run, but my legs carried me, crashing through the underbrush as fast as they could. The flashlight bounced wildly in my grip, its beam dancing between the trees as I tore through the woods. Behind me, I heard the thing. Its movements were erratic, unnaturel, like it didn't quite know how to run but was giving chase anyway. The voice echoed after me, distorted and warping as it mimicked me, calling out over and over, "Help me." I didn't stop. I didn't look back. My only focus was getting out, getting as far away as possible. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees blurring together, the darkness closing in. Finally, I saw the edge of the woods, the trailhead. I stumbled into it, panting, gasping for breath. My legs ached, my lungs burning as I collapsed against the trunk of a tree. The woods behind me were silent. I stayed there for what felt like hours, staring into the trees, waiting for the thing to emerge. But it didn't. I don't know how I made it out. I don't know what I saw. But I do know this. The voice that had followed me out wasn't mine. It never was. It started out like any other camping trip. A few of us from work decided to escape the noise of the city and venture into the wilderness for a weekend. We were no strangers to the outdoors, but this time we wanted to push ourselves a bit further, deeper into a national park that had no designated campsites, the kind of place where the trail ends and you make your own way. There were 4 of us, Mike, Sarah, Jen, and me. We parked the car at a remote trailhead and hiked for about 5 hours to a clearing by a lake. The air was crisp, the trees towering above like sentinels guarding some long-forgotten secret. It was perfect. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we set up camp and built a fire. The first night was calm, full of laughter and shared stories under the blanket of stars. It was everything we had hoped for, until the noises started. It was subtle at first, a rustling in the bushes, the sound of branches snapping in the distance. We all chalked it up to animals. "Probably deer," Mike said, poking the fire with a stick. We were in their territory after all. But then came the whispers. At least that's what I thought they were. It was so faint I almost convinced myself it was the wind. But around 2 a.m., I woke up in my tent. Something felt off. I unzipped the flap and peered out. The fire had died down to embers, and everything was eerily still. Too still. Then I heard it. A low, guttural hum, almost like chanting, drifting through the trees. I froze, scanning the dark woods, straining my ears. The sound seemed to come from all around us, yet nowhere at once. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Jen's tent rustled as she sat up, her silhouette barely visible in the faint moonlight. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, though she probably couldn't see me. "Yeah, I thought it was..." A loud snap, like a tree branch being torn in half, echoed from the direction of the lake. We all shot up now, Mike grabbing the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but it felt wrong. Like the light couldn't penetrate far enough, as if the woods were swallowing it. We were wide awake now, adrenaline spiking as more sounds followed. Shuffling feet, distant laughter, sharp and hollow like it didn't belong to anything human. We huddled together around the dying fire, weapons in hand. A hatchet, a knife, anything we could grab. "Maybe it's other campers messing with us," Sarah offered, though she didn't sound convinced. Mike stood up, shining the flashlight toward the lake. "We should check it out. If there are people out there screwing with us, we need to..." "Wait," Jen interrupted. "Listen." The chanting had stopped. The silence was deafening. No wind, no animals, nothing. Then something splashed in the lake, hard, like something large had just been thrown into the water. Our heads snapped toward the sound. Mike aimed the flashlight, but the beam flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. Before any of us could react, there was movement. Fast, too fast. Something large and heavy rushed through the underbrush, the snapping of branches coming toward us, toward the camp. We bolted. We didn't even think to grab our gear. All I remember is the frantic scramble through the trees, the wet leaves slipping underfoot as we ran blindly in the dark. The sound of whatever it was grew louder, almost deafening. I could feel its presence as if it was breathing down my neck. We didn't stop until we reached the trailhead. Somehow we had made it back to the car. Out of breath and shaking, we piled in, Mike fumbling with the keys. We peeled out of there, the tires kicking up dirt as we sped down the gravel road. It wasn't until we were a few miles away that anyone spoke. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, clutching her knees to her chest. No one had an answer. We drove in silence, the only sound the rumble of the engine and our labored breathing. But then, as we rounded a bend in the road, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure standing in the middle of the road. It was just a glimpse, a flash of white, pale against the dark forest. But it was enough. My stomach turned to ice. I didn't mention it to the others. I figured my mind was playing tricks on me. The next day, we reported the incident to the park rangers. They said there shouldn't have been anyone else out there. The area was too remote, and they hadn't issued any permits for that region. They chalked it up to our nerves, maybe the isolation getting to us. But something wasn't right. After we got home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked outside my apartment window, I felt eyes on me, just out of sight. 2 nights later, Mike was found dead. His body was discovered floating in a nearby lake. The official report said he drowned, but that didn't make sense. Mike was an experienced swimmer. He had grown up near the water. I went to his funeral, still haunted by the memory of that night. After the service, I approached Jen and Sarah. I needed to talk about it, to figure out what happened. But when I brought it up, they stared at me like I was insane. "What camping trip?" Sarah asked, eyes wide with confusion. My heart sank. I looked at Jen, expecting her to remember to back me up. She shook her head. "We haven't been camping in years." I left, shaking, heart pounding in my chest. I knew what I had seen. I knew what we had been through, but now, I'm not sure anymore. And late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear the chanting. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, One of those unplug, get back to nature kind of weekends. Me and 3 of my closest friends, Sarah, Kyle, and Jess. We'd been planning it for weeks, hyping ourselves up about escaping the city, breathing fresh mountain air, and spending 2 nights in the woods near a place called Pine Hollow. It wasn't the most popular spot for campers, but that's what drew us in. The isolation. Looking back, I should have known something was off the moment we arrived. Pine Hollow wasn't like any forest I'd seen before. The trees grew thick and dense, their branches twisted in ways that made them look almost alive. But what really hit us was the silence. No birds, no insects. Just the sound of our own footsteps crunching against the dead leaves. Kyle made a joke about it, something like, maybe the animals know something we don't. We all laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We set up camp at the base of a small hill, with just enough clearing to give us a view of the night sky. By the time the sun began to set, we had a fire going and were trading stories, the usual banter you'd expect on a trip like this. But as soon as the last sliver of light disappeared behind the horizon, everything started to feel wrong. It began with little things. First, the fire, which had been roaring moments earlier, suddenly struggled to stay lit. No wind, no rain, just this unnatural choking of the flames. We fed it more wood, but nothing helped. Sarah, who was always the skeptical one, laughed it off, blaming the damp air. But I could see it in her eyes. She was nervous too. An hour later, Jess started hearing something in the woods behind us. A faint whisper, like a voice carried by the wind, but too low for any of us to make out. We chalked it up to her imagination. "It's the woods," Kyle said. "They play tricks on your mind." But then we all heard it. A low hum, almost melodic, echoing through the trees. We shone our flashlights around, trying to find the source, but the beams were swallowed by the dark, never quite landing on anything. The noise would stop the second we stood up, only to return the moment we settled back down, like it was waiting for us to let our guard down. That's when Jess saw her. Across the clearing, standing just beyond the reach of our firelight, was the figure of a woman. She was pale, almost glowing, her hair long and wild, draped in a torn white dress that fluttered, though there was no breeze. Her face, I couldn't see it clearly, but there was something wrong about the way she moved. Jerky, like she didn't quite belong in her own skin. Jess screamed, and when we all turned to look, she was gone. No footsteps, no sound, just vanished. We tried to laugh it off as stress or exhaustion. I mean, it had been a long day, right? But none of us could shake the feeling that we weren't alone anymore. Kyle suggested we go to bed, convinced it was all in our heads, but I wasn't so sure. My gut told me to stay alert. Sometime in the dead of night, I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing outside my tent. It wasn't human. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on the air, slow and labored, like some huge animal just inches away. I held my breath, praying it would go away. But then came the scratching, a slow, deliberate scraping against the fabric of my tent, like claws teasing the surface. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. I could only listen as the sound circled the tent, moving from one side to the next. I knew the others were hearing it too. I could hear Sarah whispering my name from her tent, her voice barely audible. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl that made my skin crawl. And then, silence. When morning came, I wasn't sure if it had been a dream. But when we crawled out of our tents, we found deep, claw-like marks etched into the dirt around our camp. Not bear tracks, not wolf. Something bigger, something that didn't fit the description of any animal we knew. We packed up in record time, none of us willing to stay a minute longer than we had to. As we hiked back to the car, I noticed something strange. Small piles of stones placed at the base of certain trees. They were spaced evenly, almost ritualistically, throughout the forest. Jess asked if any of us had noticed them on the way in, but none of us had. That's when we met the old man. He was sitting by the trailhead, weathered and hunched, his eyes clouded with age. As we passed, he asked if we had stayed the night in the hollow. We nodded, thinking nothing of it, until he muttered under his breath, "She still walks, doesn't she?" We stopped cold. "Who?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. He looked at me with eyes that seemed to see more than the present. "The bride, the one who was left waiting at the altar. They say she wanders the forest looking for her groom. If you see her, don't let her know. If she thinks you're him." His voice trailed off, leaving us in uneasy silence. We left without another word, but the image of that woman, the way she moved, haunted me for days. But here's the twist, the part that keeps me up at night. A few weeks after the trip, I was scrolling through old photos on my phone, and I found one I didn't remember taking. It was from the campsite that night. In the photo, we were sitting around the fire, laughing, not a care in the world. But in the background, just beyond the edge of the light, there was the figure of a woman, her face turned toward us. Not blurry, not shadowy, clear as day. And her eyes, they were fixed on me. I'll never forget the last time I went camping. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend in the mountains with my girlfriend Jess. We had both been swamped with work for months, and this trip was meant to be a much-needed escape from it all. Just the two of us, a tent, and the stillness of nature. We chose a spot we'd been to a couple of years back, nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The kind of place where your phone loses signal, and the only sounds you hear are the wind in the trees and the occasional distant call of a bird. We thought it would be perfect. The hike to the campsite was longer than I remembered. The forest seemed denser this time, more overgrown, like no one had set foot on the trail in years. As we pushed deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to grow taller, their branches weaving together overhead, blocking out the late afternoon sun. By the time we reached the clearing, dusk was already settling in, and we scrambled to set up our tent before dark. Once the tent was up, we got a small fire going and sat back to enjoy the quiet. The sky above was a deep, starless black, and the only light came from the flickering flames in our lantern. It was peaceful, at least for a while. But as the night wore on, something started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but there was a tension in the air, like the forest around us was watching. Jess must have felt it too, because she kept glancing toward the trees, her brow furrowed. "Do you hear that?" she asked suddenly. I stopped mid-sentence, listening. At first there was nothing, just the usual crackling of the fire and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then, faint and distant, I heard it too. A low rhythmic sound, like something was scraping against wood. It was subtle at first, barely audible over the fire, but it had an unnatural consistency, like it was deliberate. I told myself it was just a branch swaying in the wind or some animal moving through the underbrush, but deep down, I didn't believe it. Jess shifted closer to me, her eyes darting toward the tree line. "That's not normal, right?" I shook my head slowly. "No, it's not." The scraping continued, slowly growing louder, closer. It sounded like it was circling us, moving through the woods just beyond the reach of the firelight. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight, and shone it into the trees. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating nothing but the twisted trunks of old pines and tangled brush. The sound stopped. For a moment, the silence felt heavier than before, like the forest itself had frozen in place, waiting. Then, out of nowhere, Jess gasped, "Look!" I turned, following her gaze, and saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the faint glow of the fire. At first I thought it was a person, someone lost, maybe. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't right. The figure was too tall, its limbs too long and spindly. It stood perfectly still, just watching us. I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette, an unnatural shape that seemed almost part of the forest itself. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "We need to go," I whispered. Jess nodded, eyes wide with fear. We both moved slowly, trying not to draw attention. But the moment I grabbed my backpack, the figure took a step forward. That's when I noticed its face, and there wasn't one. Where the face should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin, pale and almost glowing in the faint light. The thing's body seemed to ripple, like its shape wasn't fixed, like it was constantly shifting in the dark. "We're leaving," I called out, my voice shaky. "We don't want any trouble." But it didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving, except for the slow, disturbing flow of its body. I threw my pack over my shoulder, and Jess grabbed her gear. We began backing away, keeping our eyes on the figure, but every few steps it would move closer, always just at the edge of the firelight. Then, without warning, the fire went out. It didn't flicker or die down. It just vanished, as if something had snuffed it out all at once. We were plunged into darkness. Jess screamed, and I fumbled with my flashlight, heart racing. When I finally managed to click it on, the figure was gone. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Jess's hand. We bolted down the trail, my flashlight bouncing wildly as we ran through the underbrush. The trees closed in around us, their branches clawing at our clothes and skin as we pushed through the dense forest. I could hear Jess's panicked breathing beside me, and somewhere behind us, the sound of those same slow, deliberate footsteps. It was following us. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to blur, and the forest felt endless, like it was twisting and shifting, trying to trap us. Every time I glanced back, I saw nothing, but I could feel it behind us, just out of sight, chasing us. Finally, after what felt like hours, we stumbled out onto the main trail. Our car was still parked at the trailhead, and we didn't waste a second. We threw our gear in the trunk, jumped in, and sped down the mountain road without looking back. We didn't speak the entire drive home. Neither of us wanted to talk about what we had seen, what had chased us through the woods. But I know it wasn't a dream, and I know Jess felt the same. Since that night, I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something followed us back. Sometimes late at night, I hear that same scraping sound outside my window, faint but unmistakable. And once, just once, I thought I saw a figure standing in the shadows at the edge of my yard, tall, spindly, and watching. I never go camping anymore.